Good morning. We're going to start here. So yesterday was sort of about theory and discussion about things that are going on in the broader world of journalism. And today is more of an interactive kind of workshop-y day that's more practical. So, be sure to participate with questions, with comments, with anything you got, and don't hold back on that. I want to introduce the sort of main character today, who is Dhrumil Mehta, who is the deputy director of the Tau Center. And he is a brilliant data journalist who is an assistant professor here. Associate, that's better, isn't it? Professor here at the journalism school, and also a visiting professor at Harvard. He has done groundbreaking work in data journalism and is the perfect person to take us through this stuff today. So be sure to, keep your laptops going, participate, ask questions. Nothing will be regarded as too basic or too sophisticated. So with that, I give you Dhrumil. I actually came up here to say a specific thing, so let me say it. One of the focuses of this two-day conference is journalism ethics. And, how does this play out in the world of AI in the newsroom? It plays out in a million tiny decisions. And that's part of what we're going to be trying to do today, is to do all these things, whether it's teaching with AI, whether it's editing with AI, or whatever else we're doing, with an ethical structure behind it that helps us to do our work in a way that makes sense for our readers and that we can be proud of. So I wanted to say that. Okay, now to Dhrumil.
Alrighty, thank you very much. Appreciate the intro, Margaret. Today's first panel is about editing AI-powered journalism. I'll ask our panelists to come on up. We've got a really great lineup today. So as we get started, this session is what we've learned so far. I think there are no defined frameworks for editing AI-powered journalism yet. We're kind of figuring it out as we go. And y'all can come on up and have a seat. And so these are our esteemed panelists today are folks who have been messing around with AI in a newsroom, using it for important journalistic purposes, and then asking themselves, how do we make sure that this meets our standards of rigorous and ethical journalism? So you're welcome to leave some questions in there. You can also see everyone else's questions, so feel free to scan this QR code. Or today really is a laptops and phones and sort of active learning day, so feel free to have your laptop out and participate as we go along. So our panelists are Anu Narayanswamy from the Washington Post over there, Andrew Rodriguez Calderon from the Marshall Project, Tazbia Fatima, who's from Hearst and is also a graduate of our Computer Science and Journalism dual master's program. So if you're interested in that, let me know. And we have Ryan Kost and Willow Higgins from Columbia Journalism Investigations, and Aisvarya Chandrasekar, who is at the Tau Center as well. All right. So we're going to come back to these questions. They're on that website, so you can take a look at them. We'll use them to guide some of the Q&A at the end. But before we get started, instead of talking in abstractions, I figured I would like for each presenter to show off some of the projects that they've worked on, so that when we do get to what are the guiding principles that everybody is following, what are the kind of best practices that we're coming to, we can ground that discussion in real world examples. So we'll start out with Anu. I've got a ticker over here, so it's the right and left button, and then you'll have to share, you just grab a mic from, we don't have enough mics for everyone, so you have to grab a mic. All right, so we'll start with Anu, and each panelist will have about 5 to 7 minutes. They'll present to you their use case, and then we can talk more generally about editing principles.
Is this on? It is. All right. Hi, my name is Anu Narayanswamy. I'm the Deputy Data Director at the Washington Post. We are a team of about 12 journalists at the Washington Post, embedded in various departments, and I oversee part of the team. In the last year and a half, we've been experimenting a little bit more with AI tools and have encouraged many of our data journalists to see how they can use it in as many stories as possible. Some of them are successful, some of them not so much, and we move on. And I can show you, these are a few of the stories that we've worked on in the last year or so, which have been fairly successful in what we've been able to do. And as an editor, how I think about it is I look at a question. Is this something that I can do faster? Is it something that we can make AI work with us to give us better results and also test the accuracy of this easily? So we're not going to put something out there which we know is not right, of course, but beyond that, we have to have a valid way of checking our results that we're getting. And in all these stories, that's been really important. So if you're looking at some of the stories, I can move back and forth between these slides. So for example, for the Tesla crash complaints, one of the things that we want to look at is, in general, ask a question: has a car crashed when the lanes disappeared? So we looked at all these documents that we'd got about Tesla car crashes, and we were able to examine whether this happened. And the AI tool helped us understand the semantic searches that are required for this kind of analysis. So the AI tool helped us look at all these documents and look up the one which said that when exiting on a ramp, the car suddenly swerved to the left. So how this helped is we were able to translate a question that we were asking the AI prompt in a more broader framework. And we were able to do that for a couple of other stories, including speeches. Since we do a lot of political coverage, we were able to look at a bunch of documents and speeches and recordings and analyze that. We've also used several AI categorization tools for work surrounding social media and things like that.
Do you mind if I just jump in really quick for a vocabulary word? So semantic search. How many people have heard of semantic search?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so one of the capabilities of AI is, generally if you were looking through these kinds of documents, you'd look for the word lane, lane disappeared, lane marker vanished. But some of the documents might say something like, the paint was chipped, and that doesn't have the word lane in it anywhere, or the road was completely decimated. Does not have the word lane in it anywhere, right? And so one of the things semantic search can help you do is, without looking for a particular word, you can still kind of get at instances of that thing.
Right, sorry, I should have explained that better. And we also realized that we were able to, AI tools are good at translation of foreign languages and also detect misspellings, which is very, very critical, because otherwise think about it as if you're doing a control search, you might miss a misspelling. You'll never be able to catch it, and that might be really interesting. AI tools are capable to go beyond that in a way. This is a product called Haystacker that was developed by the data engineering team at the Washington Post, and we partnered with them in kind of showing them what we wanted to be able to do with this. And how we used it in this story was to look at ads which were created and by mainly Republican people running for Congress, or even presidential, and some lieutenant governor and governor races also. And what this tool essentially does is it grabs the video and looks for certain features that we are looking for. In this example, we were looking for things like soldier, or if there was a gun present in this kind of a campaign. So we were able to detect about, out of the 750 images that we had, or videos that we had, we could estimate there were some 156 at least which had these kind of features and characters present. So Haystacker is a tool basically which works with ChatGPT 4, but can also work on other AI platforms. And the reason we created it that way was because this is a fast developing world, and we want to make it open such that it can move between these different programs and see which one is working best and use that. On the editing side of this, what was really, really important for us is to make sure that these features or these videos and imagery that we're looking at is actually present in these videos. And to be able to do that, we actually got a team of reporters to work with us and identify whether these images were actually there, at least for a large section of the videos we were looking at. And we found that Haystacker had a very good accuracy, percentage of accuracy, which we felt comfortable with, and we felt we were okay in actually citing that number in our stories. Climate Answers is a AI generative tool that the Washington Post also has. This is not coming out of the data team. It is a product and engineering tool which was developed, which is kind of a layer over our climate initiative and climate reporting. Essentially, it allows people to ask a question. It searches all the articles we have about within our climate team and surfaces those to answer the question. And essentially, this has so we did a lot of research before we developed this tool. Our engineers and our product people went out and talked to people and asked them about what they would like and rely on AI to do well. And one of the things we learned was efficiency was important, in the sense that the summarization and the AI tool that could summarize something would be useful for people. Also realized that they wanted some oversight over the AI tool, not just something that would give them crappy answers. And also have the same kind of journalistic sentiment and human touch attached to it. So this was the learning that they went ahead with to develop the Climate Answers tool. And one of the goals of this tool has also been to say it's okay when we don't know something. We're not Google. We don't have to surface any kind of answer. The bot will definitely say, I don't have this answer. You might have to go look elsewhere, something like that, if it can't generate a good enough answer. And this is just some best practices as an editor and as a reporter working with these tools. Hand check a significant part of your data to make sure that what you're putting out there is accurate. Build a fact-checking system just as you would for any other story, and really concentrate on whether you can say what you want to say because of what the tool has given you. Learn together. We're not all experts, and there are some people who know one aspect and other people that know other. Learn together, grow, experiment. Also, writing a methodology. As an editor, in many cases, when I see a really good data story, I actually read the methodology first because it's everything. The most important parts and holes in your analysis come through when you write out your methodology. And also be transparent about what you did. For the Haystacker story, for example, we actually told people we were using a vision-based AI tool to do that story. So that kind of transparency is also really important for readers and making that available. So these are some of the things that we follow, and I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you. We'll go through all the examples first, and then we'll ask some questions. But there are some interesting things there. For example, that you said at least 156 videos have soldiers. That at least part, right? That's something that with the AI it may be 158. Maybe the AI missed 2. You need to have some sense, but it's like, is it 600? Is it 100? Like, we have some sense of how many could be off. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the sure. Q&A. And also the Climate Answers bot was fascinating, and we'd love to hear about how, ChatGPT is known to hallucinate, right? Like make up answers, and so how y'all protected against that. But we'll get to the Q&A in just a bit. Let's give everyone a chance to sort of go through their use cases so we can compare and contrast. We'll see.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Is this working? Hello. Great. I'm going to stand up because otherwise I feel like I'm going to have a crooked neck by the time that I'm done with this. Hi, everyone. It's very nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. So my name is Andrew Rodriguez Calderon. I'm a data project lead at the Marshall Project. I also teach collaborative design at the New School, and I work as a collaborative designer and engineering lead with the design lab, where we do a lot of this work as well as community engagement. So the approach I'm going to take with this presentation is a little different. I'm not going to take you deep into each of the use cases, but rather talk in terms of the problem that we decided to try to solve with AI and the solution, and then leave any of the probative questions that I hope you all have for the discussion as well as the Q&A. So there are three different use cases I want to tell you about. A piece of context first is that at the Marshall Project, every organization is at a different place in terms of their journey and relationship to these tools. The Marshall Project, we were lucky enough to get a grant from the American Journalism Project. We're a part of their AI cohort, thanks in part to OpenAI giving them $250,000 for us to be able to do this work. So it's myself and two other people who are really developing these experiments. So we don't have any published use cases. We're still in the process of developing them and also figuring out what it means to galvanize the resources of a newsroom that's medium-sized, has national coverage as well as local bureaus, and wants to do it all. And so I won't be able to show you, none of these examples are published yet, but they're things we're actively working on and we hope to publish at some point. So the first problem that we decided to approach was an extraction problem. We received copious amounts of FOIA responses generated in the criminal justice reporting process, but they're largely unstructured data. And so we decided that we wanted to try to use AI to analyze that unstructured data and extract information from it. I take this adage of drowning in knowledge and starving for wisdom as kind of a guiding star for the way in which we approach this problem. This is an example of the kind of document that we typically receive, something that could be OCR'd, but you may end up, you could use optical character recognition. Basically, you pass it into an algorithm that can handle the fact that it's on a grid, but may still make mistakes. So then you end up having to pre-process and clean the data. And so we wanted to see if AI could do a better job with this. I'll mention this later in the reflections, but one of the things when you're dealing with AI is this sort of spectrum of, is this process deterministic? Can I really control what's happening at every step of the way? Or is it non-deterministic? Where is it falling on the spectrum? And so we've tried to use tools like building in these sort of frameworks that establish what field should look like when we're processing the data to be able to avoid false positives. And that's something that keeps coming up often because like you're going to hear, I think, on this panel a lot, we're often dealing with this margin of error that sometimes it's really hard to even quantify because of the way that LLMs in particular, but I think different kinds of machine learning algorithms writ large output their products. And so this is one problem that we're dealing with. Another problem, some of you may have heard this term already, retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. This is the notion of, I have a bunch of information, it could be documents, videos, I want to put it into a database. I want to query in a chat interface, for example, the LLM, it'll go it'll go and retrieve the information that's relevant from the database, pull it in, and then try to give you an answer that's more specialized, right? So for example, if I'm asking something about a policy, a book ban policy in New York, it won't go and pull every single book ban policy from every single state because that's not necessary. It's computationally intensive. Rather, it'll just go into my database, pull the pieces of the policy from New York that are relevant, and use that to generate the answer that can increase the likelihood that you get a sensical and hopefully accurate answer. And so that's actually the instance that I'm working on right now most intensively. Last year, I worked on a project for a year of book censorship in prisons, and all of it was undergirded by a collaborative design process. So we were talking with folks who are incarcerated, their loved ones, groups that are trying to send books into prisons, and asking them, what is the biggest issue that you have? And one of them was that when they get a rejection from a Department of Corrections, they're citing policy, but oftentimes they either can't find the policy online because whatever. some institutions, public institutions, are really bad at making things available online, or when they do find it, it's in this bureaucratic legalese that they can't make sense of. And so to me, that seemed like a really ripe opportunity for something that an LLM can do really well. It can translate legalese into something that is more discernible for somebody who's not an expert in that space, and then cite the relevant parts of the policy and let that person use their critical thinking skills to decide whether or not that is the information that we need. And so that's something else that I'm working on. Here's an example of what some of the policies look like. It seems
And
like you
when
have
you
a
say
question.
that person, do you mean the public, or is this journalist within the Marshall Project?
I have this obsession with I have this obsession with not building tools for journalists. I think that journalism is very insular, and so often whenever we're in a newsroom, we're always thinking, how can we make the journalist job easier? I'm not saying that that's not a worthwhile thing to do, but I'm really interested in working with people who are affected by the issues that we're covering and asking them, what are the problems that you are having, and how can we use this technology to solve those? How can we help you navigate the systems that oftentimes oppress or obfuscate attempts to try to rationalize them? Fortunately, I have someone on my team who's more interested in editorial projects, so there's no dearth of those, but that's just not the thing that I'm most excited by. No value judgment there. And then the last example that I wanted to give you all is an example of fine-tuning. There's this term that some of you may have heard. It's called agentic, and so it's actually kind of one step above the example that I just showed you earlier. It's the idea of, okay, so if we can take specialized information, pass it to an LLM and make it really good at a certain thing, could we get a bunch of different LLMs, specialize them at different things, and then get them talking to each other so that the output is actually even better? There's a really good paper that was just published 2 days ago. We have a tip resource document that we put together as a panel. It's in there. Hopefully you all will get it later. But essentially, someone recreated a newsroom. And so one agent is an editor, the other agent is a reporter, the other agent is a data analyst, and they're talking to each other such that by the time that you get an output, it's gone through these filters that you, in theory, have controlled for and have kind of polished. It's by no means meant to be a replacement of any of those roles, because you still can't really trust the output, but it's supposed to make the output a little better. And so the problem in this case that I think that technique could work for is we often liaise with various departments and departments of correction across the country with similar yet distinct rules and procedures for how to get stories past censors. We have a magazine that goes out to over 1,000 prison facilities across the country, as well as in Mexico and Puerto Rico, and I think in Canada. And one of the problems that we have is that when we try to get stories past the censors, they'll say, this story talks about HIV and the way that the person contracted it. That is an illicit sexual act that's not permitted inside of, also trigger warning, I'm sorry, I should have said that, but this is an illicit sexual act that cannot be discussed inside of the context of the prison, so you can't get the story in, even if the story is actually about accessing resources or whatever. So something that we're working on is trying to fine-tune agents to act like the censors, so that when we pass in the stories that we want to send to the prison facilities, we can anticipate what kinds of things might come up. One of the really fascinating about this is that we actually need a thought partner that sometimes overshoots. We need it to be really overzealous. And so what's been really cool with our team that works on that is that the LLM will output these things saying, you might not get this past it, you might not, but it lets them evaluate that. And oftentimes, I shouldn't say, we haven't quantified how often we're working on it, but sometimes they'll say, that's probably wrong, but I'm glad that it flagged it. And so I actually think this is a really fascinating instance where sometimes false positives is a good thing. You need that. And so that's another example of a problem, a technique, and a solution that we're working on right now. These are all of the, like for example, for New York, these are all the directives for different aspects of the institution that may intersect with that product that we're trying to send. So these are the things that we would use to train. And I'll wrap up quickly, because I know we have 5 to 7 minutes. I just wanted to leave you with some reflections from a year of working on this stuff. Learning the skills to do this work takes time, and not everyone has that luxury. I have spent so many hours reading research papers, doing trainings, and it's been great. I love it, but I realize not everyone can do that, and I think that's a really big challenge, especially for smaller, medium-sized newsrooms. What's good enough performance to support a body of reporting is something we ask ourselves a lot. In the last example, we don't need 100% accuracy. If we have 50% accuracy, that's fine, because the problem doesn't call for 100% accuracy. So sometimes that's okay. Negative use cases are just as valuable as positive ones. We have lots of examples of failures that I didn't share. Not lots. We have a few examples of failures, and we study those, we anatomize them, and we learn things from them. So just because something fails doesn't mean that it's useless. And then the last two are your editorial threshold will vary depending on the problem, so whether or not you need more of a deterministic output or a non-deterministic one. And this is, I think, most important. I think this panel kind of speaks to this precept is documenting, sharing knowledge, and accessing or building communities of practice are a must. Do not work in a silo. We need to be talking to each other and sharing our work. And that's it.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
So, we'll pass the clicker to Ryan and Willow and Aishi as we get started. A couple of things. One, we're doing a lot with AI here at Columbia as well, and one of the things I loved about your presentation is it wasn't AI generating articles. Like, there are so many more use cases of AI in journalism that are there's enough to fill all of our times. The other thing I will add is we started to already see a connection between what you said and what Anu said about what is that threshold, right? So like, if we have inaccuracies, can we quantify those inaccuracies, decide whether they're important, and figure out how to communicate them to the reader instead of, chucking it because it's only 95% accurate versus 100% accurate or what have you. So that, I think, is a theme that you'll see come up over and over again. That's part of one of the things we're going to need to think more about as we start editing AI is, can we sort of quantify the inaccuracies and the uncertainties and decide what is necessary for our editorial processes. So I'll pass it on to Ryan, Willow, and Aisvarya, and they can tell you about a case that's happening here in-house in the basement. Columbia Journalism Investigations has been using AI to work on a project about prisoner exonerations.
Hi, guys. My name is Willow Higgins, and as Dhrumil mentioned, I'm a fellow with Columbia Journalism Investigations, which does long-form investigations downstairs. My friend and colleague Ryan and I have been working for the past year on a project that was supposed to be about prosecutorial misconduct across the state of New York. And specifically, we've been diving into conviction integrity units, which are these programs in district attorneys' offices that are designed to give you a bit of a more direct pathway to exoneration. Traditionally, if you're wrongfully convicted, your options are pretty narrow, and honestly, there's like a little bit of luck involved in terms of getting someone to take a look at your case and having the judge hear you out. So DAs are piloting these new programs that are, you're supposed to be able to write to them and say, hey, will you reinvestigate my claims? I think they're wrong. Our work's not out yet. It will be out hopefully this fall in December in New York Focus. Keep an eye out for it. But we're finding that these programs might not be working as well as they're supposed to be working. So to conduct this investigation, our jumping off point we've been using is this really awesome resource called the National Registry of Exonerations. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty cool, but they have tons of information specifically about exonerees across the entire country. The vast majority of people who have been exonerated end up on this database, essentially, with narrative profiles that has all sorts of really valuable stuff, especially for our purposes. Particularly, like, it does even highlight exonerees who have moved through a conviction integrity unit. And it includes information like, misconduct that led to the wrongful conviction, lawyers and their names, which is great for sourcing, lawsuits and their settlements, but it's presented in narrative form. And so Ryan and I have been reading these and have, wanting to be, using this as sort of a lead finder and a jumping off point for creating this database that we're working on of people across the state who have moved through a conviction integrity program so we can identify patterns. But doing so by hand would require us to basically extract, things from the text and put it in a spreadsheet. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of data points, which would be a pretty painstaking process. So Ryan one day was like, I wonder if maybe we can use AI to power this, and it would free up a lot of time for us to, do interviews and focus our reporting time elsewhere. But we don't know how to code, so that's where Aishi and our friends at the Tau Center came in.
So Ryan and Willow were interested in 22 data points. Can we move on to the next one? Yeah, thank you. Ooh, okay. Yeah, I think it's the next one. Okay, perfect. So Ryan and Willow were interested in close to 22 data points that they wanted to extract from each exoneree's case. And when so what we did was we scraped all these narratives, we put it through OpenAI, and we used a tool called Guardrails, and then later Instructor, to help with the prompt engineering. Our first attempt at prompt engineering resulted in a highly inaccurate and incomplete data set. And some of these issues that we saw, we were able to quickly fix just by changing the prompts around. But the more tricky issues, and I would argue the more interesting one, was where the narrative didn't explicitly state the data that we were asking from it. For example, Ryan and Willow were interested in knowing whether or not there was a Brady violation in a given case. But nowhere in the narrative are the words Brady and violation there. So you need to know what a Brady violation is. You need to know what words would, what combination of words would suggest that there is a violation. So a lot of the iterations that we used for the prompting tried to get the LLM to think like Ryan and Willow. And we experimented in a two-phase experiment. One is, can we train the LLM to think like someone like Ryan and Willow with the legal context that they have? And the other side is, can we read all these narratives and find patterns within the narratives that we could feed into this LLM so that it's a bit more accurate in identifying different cases? So we went through several rounds of iteration, close to 7 rounds of iteration, and each round resulted in a data set that Ryan and Willow would manually check to see whether or not the answers are correct. We tried to do this for 88 cases, and hopefully, if we were able to get to a certain threshold of accuracy, we would be able to expand the data set. But currently, the accuracy is much, much better than our first attempt, but it still has a lot of holes. It still has inaccuracies. Oh yeah, there's an example of the different, the evolution of the prompting. What we asked initially and how we tried to give it more context and how we tried to use the different mechanisms of prompt engineering to get a more accurate answer.
Which is a great lead into the next session, which is going to be Prompt Engineering 101, which will be at noon.
As Aishi mentioned, basically after doing this, I think 7 or 8 times, we still had a lot of holes in the data because not every single narrative was completely uniform. And while we were getting some responses that were completely accurate for a given narrative, we still had, some errors coming up. And so I think, we quickly realized if we wanted to use this data set, to actually come up with percentages or anything like that, we would have to go through and manually check every single cell in our database, which I think would still be easier than maybe manually inputting it, because you can still go and search for keywords and whatnot, and that's a lot easier than sort of reading through a text, not knowing what you're looking for. But ultimately, we decided that that was sort of not the best use case for us. As we did sort of this, as we went through, various iterations of this, we started asking it to summarize information about these cases. So, can you explain to us what was the prosecutorial misconduct in the original trial here? Can you identify any potential Brady violations, which is essentially when a prosecutor fails to hand over exculpatory evidence that could have helped a person at trial. And so with using those, when it came to sort of work on a piece of our project, which sort of looks at whether or not these units ever address prosecutorial misconduct in the original trial, like, as they're sort of looking at exonerating these people, are they actually doing anything to improve practices in these offices? We were able to really quickly scan through a bunch of these cases. So instead of reading, 90 different narratives, trying to do that quickly, not miss anything, I was able instead to sort of go through these short summaries of various prosecutorial misconduct instances, and then from there I could sort of pick out, maybe 5 or 10 cases that I thought had potential to be emblematic cases for our eventual project. So yeah, that's kind of where we've ended with this now, although, I think we're still in talks about potentially going through and vetting the entire database and expanding it, so we'll see.
I love a couple of things. One, this sort of elucidates what Andrew was talking about, which is, does the question require 100% accuracy? And in this case, you might not be able to say, 41 of the 90 cases had a Brady violation, but the AI can help you very quickly get to, are there any Brady violations? Is it a lot? Is it a little? And then that can inform the way that you sort of use it in your story. And if it identifies 40 and at least 35 of them are Brady violations, then you're like, okay, this is like a pretty big problem in this data set, right? The other thing that we're thinking about is, do we put in the effort to edit this to 100% accuracy, manually review everything and release the database? Or do we take this kind of imperfect algorithm that's like 70% right and go, let's just run it on Ohio. And we run it on Ohio instead of New York. And then we go, wow, there seem to be a lot of violations there. Should we consider like writing a story about Ohio? And so it becomes this like exploratory thing where we don't need to get to 100% accuracy, but we can get kind of a rough sense of like, oh, actually there might be more stories here, and like, let's use it for that instead. I guess the other thing I wanted to point out here is Ryan and Willow, as they mentioned, they don't code, and you can do this too. So, Andrew, you mentioned it does take a lot of resources. I'm always really impressed at the work the Washington Post and Marshall Project do. But if you're sitting in this room thinking, can I use AI for this? Our first step was just taking one of those narratives, pasting it into ChatGPT, and then starting to ask it questions like, who was the police officer? Who was the judge in this case? Did the judge do whatever? And then they did it with one document, they did it with 2 documents, they did it with 5 documents. They were like, wait a minute, this is actually pretty good. Can we do this with 1,000 documents? And that's where Aishi came in. And so you can start prototyping on your own, which is really new, because before this, in order to do something like this, I would have to get buy-in from the engineering department. I'd have to get an engineer to train a classifier. Now you can just kind of mess around with it in the ChatGPT browser console, and then if it's looking promising, then you put in a request for funding or get an engineer or what have you. So thank you. And last but not least, Tazbia.
Hi everyone. So I'm Tazbia Fatima. I'm the AI and automation engineer with Hearst Newspaper's Development Hub. But previously, my kind of journey with AI and editing AI started at this city where I was their AI and data fellow, and we started off with a prototype, with an experiment of like, okay, let's see what we can do with the ChatGPT browser or the API and see where we get. So what we did is, so the city is a local newspaper in New York, and it's been 4 years, so we wanted to do a coverage audit. We wanted to see, are we covering all of New York? Are there parts of New York we're missing out? And that was a focus for the editors to know where we are at. And also see, can we actually use, for a local newsroom that has only kind of 25 people, is AI something that we can spend some resources experimenting with? So we started off with, we wanted to do a coverage audit, and we quickly realized that with AI, you could kind of get structured data from unstructured data. So I'll speak a little about that. So we had 4,159 stories, articles that we had written, and we passed our text through OpenAI's API and wanted to extract the location of each article. And the idea was that we want to find where a story either takes place or to whom it could be meaningful. Could it be meaningful to the people living in Upper West Side, in Harlem? Or is it important to people living in Brooklyn or Staten Island? But we didn't want it to, speak to, give us a bunch of locations that a source is in, because usually when you are writing an article, you say XYZ source, a resident of, Harlem, or something like that. So we had a specific use case. We knew what we wanted to ask AI, and I think that's kind of the first step. Know what you're using the tool for. And why we chose AI over traditional method was because we wanted it to identify the more, we wanted it to identify Madison Square Garden as a stadium and not like a park, which up till then, entity recognition, which is the more machine learning method of doing it, was not able to do so. It could only say, oh, this is a location, this is not a location, etc. So we parsed our articles through that, and we were able to build 2 maps. One was by neighborhood, and one was, exactly plotting where an article took place, or so if it was a station, if it was a subway station, on 125th Street, we were able to pinpoint that. But how did we get there? We went through, so we paused everything through AI, and of course, I think, as Aishi mentioned, prompt engineering kind of solves a lot of the problems. So once you figure all of that out and take some time to do that, you get your results, you need, journalism is all about truth and honesty. We don't want to put anything out that we're not sure about. So we went through an editing pipeline. And the steps kind of was like, we were like, okay, we don't know, how do we trust what AI returns, right? So we wanted to have our ground truth values. Like, what is the base level that we're checking against, that we're fact checking against? And then we want to test the results by sampling. Sampling is this concept where you can kind of estimate how an algorithm is doing for a larger data set, say 4,000, 5,000 articles, by sampling 20% of it, 20 random, randomly selecting 20% of the data set or anything and doing that. And this is a more statistical concept. And spot checking. Every editor, even in non-AI data stories, spot checks their results. So it's still not losing our, data journalism editing processes. And of course, leaving the editorial judgments to the editor and not with AI. So we didn't want AI to tell us or another machine to tell us that, yes, we think this is correct or we think this is not correct, but let the editor make a judgment call. So how did we build the first validation pipeline or the ground truth values, right? Now, think about it as locations. Everyone uses Google Maps for location. If I want to get somewhere, I trust Google to tell me that this is the train I need to get on. So we decided to use Google's geocode API and any results. And we asked AI to return multiple results. So if a story has 2, 3 locations mentioned, we were like, okay, return them all. And then we passed all of them through Google's geocoding API using code, and we're able to get the actual kind of a standardized result for it. So we're like, okay, so now we trust this standardized result over AI, but we got the, initial content from AI. And then we passed it through, we decided to go, dig a little deeper and be like, okay, if AI has returned some latitude, longitudes, how do I test numbers? How do I check these numbers? I decided that we want to use, you kind of always fall back on traditional computational methods, and there are so many scientific, there's a way to do anything computationally these days. So you fall back on a formula. So we chose to go for a Haber-Stein formula, which kind of maps the distances between locations to points on the globe, so on a sphere, because the Earth is not flat, so distances. And then we also checked, okay, if AI is telling me this story took place at Penn Station, which neighborhood does it fall on? So we used a concept which is so simple. You check if a point falls on a polygon. So we got, so we used NYC's neighborhood tabulation areas because NYC's New York City's neighborhoods are so contested. We again wanted something that we are checking against. Like, what is the ground truth that assumptions? And this is, I think, more of a machine learning, computer science concept. Every research has some assumptions you're making so that your experiment is tight. It has a bubble around it that you're kind of falling into. So that was our approach of a more kind of a technical approach. And random sampling, this is where we involved the newsroom. So we initially just opened this up to the reporters and we were like, okay, can you check the stories you did? Can you check some other stories? And then my team and I, we spent most of our time, we spent less of time on generating the locations, but more in the checking. So I think we had a shift in our data journalism process here where we're spending more of our resources on validation and fact checking and editing. So we did that to get, and then, there were, of course it's AI, it did not hallucinate, but there is ambiguity in these results. So if there were stories that spoke about all of New York, where do I place them? So then the editor is like, why do we need to place some? We don't need to. So we will remove it off our data set and communicate this very truthfully and transparently to our readers. So whenever you have a methodology for using AI, I think it is important to know the caveats and limitations of your process, communicate that to the team, your colleagues and reporters and editors, so they can then make proper judgments on what we put out. That is 100% we are confident in. So that was the process to get to this map at the city, which kind of helped us audit our coverage, spoke about the credibility of the newsroom to the shareholders, the stakeholders. Also, our readers were able to find obscure articles from, a park in Staten Island that our reporter had covered 2 years ago, but there was someone who was living there now interested in reading it. So that was a more like validate, but using technical methods. Now at Hearst, Scout is a tool that I recently worked on and we launched. This is an internal tool that will help our sports reporter at Connecticut Insider, another local newsroom. So high school sports is a big part of Connecticut Insider's game time CD section. And they wanted so every Sunday, a reporter goes through all the 7 to 10 games that happen in that week, identifies, summarizes the games, identifies the top performers, and writes, weekly roundups. This data also includes polls that they take from their readers. So the data that you see for the final article, which is the week 2 high school football roundup, comes from multiple sources. Now we wanted to not just free up our reporter's time, but make the reporter, the reporter wanted to spend more time in adding the writing and doing the more reporting part for their article rather than spending their time pulling information from our own archives. This is information that they're pulling from our own archives. So what we did is we sent all of our articles for that week through AI. We asked it to identify the top performers, list out all the top performers, kind of scores, and any any of their gameplay. And every Saturday we send a Google Doc to our reporter. The reporter gets a notification, but this is not the final article. Like AI here is not writing the article, but it's kind of speeding up a part where we are gathering from our own archives. But how do we edit it? Of course, we obviously always want to make sure we are very transparent with our readers. So we do mention that this could be partially generated by AI, and we have our AI policy there, and we also explain how we get there. But for the editing process, here something that we did that we had to figure out. We want to make sure our reporter is not just copy pasting whatever AI sent and put it in their document, and tomorrow we see a hallucination. Was we added reporting fact-checking cues and editing cues for our reporter in the document that we are generating. So we highlighted names, we checked for spellings, we checked for are the hyperlinks working. And we gave the reporter the more, we passed the baton of editing to the reporter and be like, okay, these are the cues we are testing against. So we used AI as an extraction tool. We did have validator functions to check if the URLs are fine. If does Owen Moreland even play? Like, was it even mentioned in the article? Was Avon Old Farms even a team? So we validated against the data that we had. And then, copy editing by having a human in the loop. I think this was more of, you can't validate everything using a computational method. You need an editor to be very involved in that process. You could only kind of use AI where it's efficient. And this is kind of where, like, more of a playbook that I'm writing for my own, which is very work in progress. But it's like, you should validate to the max, break down each process and see where AI fits. Use AI only where it's adding either efficiency or it has a lot of text processing capacities that you could use. So use it there, and then try to get as close to a deterministic value. I think that is always important. We don't want to put out anything we're not sure about. And always communicate your AI policy. So that's how I've been using AI.
Cool, thank you. All right, thank you. So a couple of things from Tazbia's conversation. That was fascinating. One connection that I'm noticing already is I helped advise Ryan and Willow and Aishi's project, and they also had a similar situation where the reporter kind of becomes an editor a little bit more, and it was really interesting to see that process change in the Connecticut the football high school football thing. I think at one point we were working together, and as I was assisting Ryan and Willow, there came a point where we were like, well, if we want to edit, like make sure this thing is 100% correct, you're still going to have to go through the output of every single thing the AI returned, go through this whole spreadsheet, make sure it's correct. And they had like this kind of visceral feeling of like, what's this machine for anyways, if I'm going to have to like manually go through all of this at the end of the day. But as I was thinking through my processes when I used to work at 538, I was like, well, I would write the article and submit it, and then that's what the copy editor would do. They would go through my data points and make sure that all of them were correct. And so some of that now is falling on the reporters as well, and the roles are kind of shifting a little bit there. And so it's interesting to see that happen in sort of multiple contexts. The other thing I will say is Tazbia has she's, as I said before, one of our computer science graduates, so it's easy for her to say things like, well, it's so simple, you just check if the point's on the polygon, right? But as we think of how do we upskill or how do we make sure that we're prepared for a world where a lot of AI is produced through these journalistic processes, you don't necessarily need to know how to do those things. You don't need to know how to put a point on a polygon. But one of the things that we're realizing is there were concepts that I would only teach to like computer science dual degree students, or they would sort of come in knowing, like precision and recall, which are ways in a machine learning algorithm to identify the accuracy rates. Things like type 1 and type 2 errors. What is sampling? How does sampling work? How can we be confident that if we look at 100 items, then 90% of those are correct? What percentage of the 1,000, or 10,000 items that we're looking at are going to be correct? These are kind of vocabulary words that we're starting to realize are important for our more general MS programs. And so as you think about like, well, I can't do the amazing work that Tazbia is doing, that's fine, but we all kind of start to need to understand at least how sampling works. And so when one of these comes across your desk as an editor, you at least have some sense of like, how might I go about ensuring accuracy. Okay, so this is really exciting. I'm going back to the Padlet. You guys all asked some amazing questions. I'm going to use that to guide some of this, and then if we have a little bit of time, we can do a Q&A. But I want to start with a pretty basic one, which is some things change and some things don't change. And so I'm curious, maybe starting with Andrew, what is, because you have AI in your process, what is new and what has stayed the same? And we'll do a full round of, I'm curious to hear everyone's answers to this.
That's an interesting way to frame that question. I'll start. So the one like published use case that we have, it's also related to banned books. It's actually how I got started using these tools, was trying to solve that same problem that I mentioned, how to make sense of the policies. And so the first pass at that was just using prompt engineering to summarize the policies, come up with, like, basically classify them and say, does this policy talk about certain things that people told us they were interested in? Like, does this policy mention an appeals process, for example? And that actually allowed us to surface whether or not that was the case or wasn't the case. And so I think in that instance, one of the things that became easier was this notion of classifying, thinking through that problem. Like, I even used prompt engineering to explain the problem that I wanted to solve and say, what are some ways that I could approach it? That kind of creative process, I think, was facilitated because I didn't necessarily need someone in the newsroom to have that expertise to be able to do it. And I think that speaks to your point about not necessarily needing to have a computational background. But then once I did have a kind of an approach that I could take, I then used the prompt engineering to come up with those categories, passed in each of the policies, and summarize them. And then the thing that didn't change is what I think is the through line of what everyone is saying is, like, then with another reporter who was working with us, we needed to go in and make sure that everything that was summarized in those categories was accurate. And so we needed to look at every single one of the policies. And I think it's interesting because I feel like it's kind of beguiling, like, especially, tech companies, I think, sell us this notion of productivity. We're so obsessed with it. I think it's also a very American thing. It's just like, can we make it faster? Can we make it more efficient? But there are some things that I don't think we need to do faster. There are some things that I don't think we need to do more efficiently. And fact checking and making sure that we agree with the language, that it meets style and standards, that it's not dehumanizing, is one of those things that maybe we don't need to outsource to a machine. Maybe that is perfectly within the purview of a human being, and maybe it's worth the time that it takes.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how maybe some of our expectations going in are, this is going to be less granular, less tedious, and sometimes you can do a lot more ambitious work, but it is sometimes like very granular and very tedious. Anu, what's new and what's the same?
I think as journalists, we are trained to ask questions and we're trained to examine a thesis. So that's the same kind of rigor and approach you bring to any kind of tooling that you're using. You're asking a question and allowing it to lead you to something that you then examine as whether it's going one way or the other. So I think that kind of questioning and generating ideas using these concepts or using these LLM tools is similar in journalism and in this kind of tooling.
I guess what's new is just sort of how you arrive at the information that you're going to be looking at. So, I mean, in this case, you know, we had an amazing system that allowed us to surface things in a different way. But aside from that, I mean, the reporting, the fact checking, all of that feels, you know, like things that we would have done 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I think. I mean, you're still sort of just looking for patterns in the information that is before you in the same way and trying to find the leads that you're, you know, you would have identified before in the same way. So I think it's sort of how you get to that first part of it has changed, but the journalism part of it doesn't seem like it has, at least not to me.
I think that about covers it. The only thing I'll say is that, like, it would be really exciting to be able to scale like what we've done up and apply it to different states or different counties, or to like really nail it down. We didn't get there for this particular project and like our timeline, because the editing process would have been so robust and time consuming that, like, as Dhrumil mentioned, like really going through every cell and making sure we get it right. And then like even, you know, probably changing the prompt engineering, like even more so to make sure it like nails it more consistently in future iterations. And that would be a tedious fact checking process. But, you know, once it's done, then you know, hopefully we've made a little machine that can be employed and make editing easier in the future for other people taking on this project. But yeah.
Yeah, sometimes the dividends come a year down the line when you want to rerun it on last year's data or something, and then you've already got the process. But I think one thing we are kind of grappling with is, like, is it worth it? Do we want to edit the whole thing, or do we just use this as a lead generator and kind of, you know, maybe we'll get more value out of it that way. Tazbia, what's new and what's the same?
I think for me, you know, as a data journalist or like developer, a lot has changed, because previously we would build the classification model, and I do miss it sometimes. So that has changed for me. But I think so. What has changed? The way we look. I think there's so much focus that you know, when you take responsibility of data for a data journalism project, what has changed in my process is the responsibility I now take to like check everything. I'm like, no, it can't go wrong, and I need to, you know, there's a lot of due diligence I think has not changed. It's just that where I put it has changed. So now, and a lot of, you know, using AI efficiently comes with how the process. So there's a lot more focus on actually asking the question, like, what do I even want to know from this, right? What am I using it for? So there's, I think, a little bit more focus on kind of your project design. Like, am I thinking through this right? Is my pipeline right? And I think that starting process and that finishing process is taking a lot more due diligence now, whereas previously I would be like, no, I need to make this model reach 95% accuracy, and I will make sure that you know, my precision and recall is correct. So I think also another thing I've noted is because AI at its current stage, it's more conversational. It does return a textual output, or even if it returns a JSON output, we're using a lot more natural language processing, you know, capabilities. So I think even with Haystacker's methodology, it's a computer vision tool. It's kind of, you know, parsing through images, but the result that it gives, the way we need to check it, requires natural language processing. So I think technically a lot has changed, but in terms of editing process, like what you're focusing on, like checking.
I think what I'm hearing is roles are really changing. The reporters are having to be more like editors, and the developers are having to be more like reporters, and we're kind of being a lot more interdisciplinary in the process of checking these things. So I have a couple of sort of more targeted questions. First one is for Anu, you know, and this is something that some folks have asked in the Padlet at the beginning as well. You know, I think you have a unique problem, which is everybody's like, we're gonna check this thing by humans before the output goes out the door, but with the climate bot, the bot is generating the text that the user is directly reading. And we know that AI tools have this problem of hallucinations or confabulations. I don't love the term hallucinations. But My wife is a neurologist, so we're very particular about these things. So can you tell us a little bit more about how did you edit something that is probabilistic, where you have no idea what even if you've checked what all the previous readers have gotten, you have no idea what the next reader is going to get?
So there are some measures or stop gaps to point at some of these problems that's already pre-built into the system. For instance, there's a very specific cutoff date. It's not looking for articles 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's more recent. That's one way. It's definitely looking at just the climate team's reporting on these various subjects. There are also several layers of protection that is included in the system, in the backend system, that doesn't allow for any kind of prompt injection or problems like that. And we created a huge testing process for several months before this went out the door. It was open to people in the newsroom, and reporters, really hard-nosed reporters, gave it a whirl before it went out the door. So far, I don't think it's caused as much, any of those hallucinations. The other thing is there are very specific questions that it can and cannot answer. If it cannot answer a specific question because those terms have never been covered in the climate arena by our team of reporters, then it would say that, sorry, I don't have an answer for you, and that's okay. So that's a definite fallback on, and many questions that I've tried out, it actually says that. So these are all kind of parameters that have been built into the system.
Thanks. And so I also want to go back to something, Andrew, you said earlier, and this is something that is a question directly from the audience as well. They say the subject of AI tools being good enough to support a project has been mentioned several times. How do you establish a framework to determine what is agreed to be good enough?
Yeah, I think this has also been coming up quite a bit on the panel. It really depends on the problem. It depends on how accurate you need it to be and what stage in the reporting you're at. So I think you alluded to this, but if you're just prototyping to, for example, get a sense of whether or not something is in a data set or is in a corpus, maybe it's good enough, right? It's good enough just to be like, okay, it's catching instances, I verified them, it seems like it's worth us continuing this effort, basically a litmus test. Maybe if you want to get a sense of scale and then you have that ground truth, you do the same thing, and you say, okay, it seems like there are at least 100 entries in here, but 20% of them were false. But if we have 1,000, so is it worth it, right? For us to, I'll say maybe that sounds wishy-washy, and I think it is, and I'm always happy to admit when things are imperfect because this is still new in this domain. It's very new. I think in many ways the news industry is really far behind the tech industry for understandable reasons, and so we still don't have jargon or language to talk about these things. But I think that encountering these issues and establishing those benchmarks is part of the work. It's part of the work, and that's why it's so important for us to work out in public so that we can talk about these things and hopefully eventually have some vocabulary around it.
Yeah, it sounds like the underlying question here is good enough for what? Is it good enough for publishing this database? No, the work that we've done, it's not good enough yet to publish the whole database. But let's say I look through 90 exonerations, the AI says 40 of them have Brady violations. I've manually looked at 25 of them and they have Brady violations. It's this is enough of a problem that it's going to be a story. I might not put the numbers in the story, but clearly this is an issue that's happening and I can write about it, right? So good enough for what is a great question, and sometimes it's not good enough to publish the entire data set and make sure everything is right. How much time do we have left, by the way? Oh, 5 minutes. Okay. So one last question, I think, for the whole panel, and then I'll turn it over to Q&A from you all. One person in the audience asked, what should we tell our reporters about using AI tools in their reporting and writing? And so I think we've got a overabundance of engineering types on the panel today. But what about the rest of us? What advice would you give to somebody who's kind of new to this, who's starting to mess around with prompt engineering? Ryan and Willow had this kind of thought of could I use AI to do this? What sort of advice would you give them? And maybe I'll start with Andrew, and we'll just come this way.
Pass the mic down just in case anyone. I'll just say one. for me, I think it's it's privacy. It's like, what are you passing into the model? Have you looked at the model that you're using? Like, we often ignore terms of service with good reason. There's actually a study that showed that if people tried to read the terms of service that companies give to us, it would take like decades. So it's literally made to not be read. But there is this kind of practice among companies that are putting out these models to make them more legible, for a human being, not for some immortal being. And so looking to see what happens with the data that I pass in, I think, is so important. Like, we think about that a lot because we deal with people's information about the criminal justice system, and we would hate for anything like that that's private and potentially deleterious to appear in someone's output. We just would want to avoid that. So that's the first thing. It's like, is it okay for you to pass this information in? Is it private? Is it publicly accessible, et cetera?
Yeah, that's really useful to keep in mind. I know ChatGPT has a button where you can like turn off like, please don't train the model on my inputs. I don't know if I trust that. Like, my information is still going to OpenAI, so I would never put anything confidential in there. There are open source models that you can run on your own computer where the data sort of never leaves your own sandbox. And if I was working with something sensitive, I would consider first going there. So that's great. Never put anything sensitive into a model. Anu?
I'm finding that reporters around the newsroom are using it for general research purposes, especially for, like climate research articles or scholarly articles. One of our health reporters recently told me that that's the first thing he does every time he's looking for a new concept he wants to write about. He goes to ChatGPT or any other, or I think he uses Perplexity because that's tooled better for sifting through scholarly articles and gives him the best kind of synopsis and work. So I think more and more reporters are using it as a more generalized research tool.
Yeah, and one caveat with that is the sort of ChatGPT that you get in the browser. I would never use it for fact retrieval. Like, it will just give you incorrect facts. But there are tools that are like, sort through all the articles in PubMed and get me the most relevant ones to, a particular kind of seizure activity or something, right? And like that kind of thing. So you also have to make sure you have a specialized tool for that particular kind of fact retrieval. Aisy?
Yeah, I think because this question is posed for someone who hasn't really worked with ChatGPT before, when you first use it, the amazement of what the ChatGPT could return, it gives you a false sense of its accuracy. So I would just be cautious about trusting what it returns. And the more you use it, you'll understand its limitations. So even though I say be mindful of trusting it, I would encourage you to use it a bit more so that you understand what these limitations are, and try to approach it with curiosity.
Yeah, I've observed dozens of students at this point and journalists discovering ChatGPT for the first time, and I've noticed a sort of pattern of like, whoa, this is cool, and then like, 30 minutes later, this is complete garbage, I'm never going to use it again, right? And then there's kind of this in between of like, now how can we thoughtfully use it, build processes around it, what can it do, how can it help me, and getting to that point generally requires going through both of those phases. So.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that it's really good to sort of work on these projects if you come up with one with people from different domain expertises, because I think, we gave our first shot at our prompts for the model and then went over to Aishi, and they've changed so much over that time and in ways that I don't think I would have been able to sort of think up myself. One point we were like looking for dates, and so Aishi was like, well, let's just ask it to collect all the dates at once, and then from there we can pull like the dates that we need out of that with like another prompt. And so just like the way that you think about things, I think it helps if you have like a lot of collaborators who have different sorts of perspectives on a problem.
Yeah, and you're going to discover this also during the session in the evening about data visualization with ChatGPT. You'll tell it like, make me a chart, and it'll make something that's complete crap. But then once you understand the data, figure out how to talk to it, you can actually pretty easily get it to do the kinds of things you want it to do. Willow?
I'm so new at this too that I'm not sure that I have like a super awesome answer in terms of words from the wise, but I will say like it is just really cool to hear what other people are doing, like even on this panel. It's really inspiring, and oftentimes people publish their methodologies, which is something that we plan to do too. And it's all so new, but it's great and just fascinating to like read how people, their brains just naturally gravitate towards different like first steps in terms of how to tackle these problems. And so, yeah, I mean, just reiterating what my peers and colleagues have said, like take inspiration from the people around you and, you know, use different minds and read what other people have been doing and, you know, their first stabs.
Yeah, sometimes it's there is also this emotional step of like coming at it with curiosity instead of with revulsion or, you know, obviously skepticism. You should have skepticism and curiosity. Together they make a great pair. Tazbia.
I think if we're, you know, I agree with, I know that a lot of reporters use it for general research, but also I think as a newsroom, even if it's as small as an editor, a reporter, a data person, or fact checker, I think it's important to like talk about AI, just figure out an AI policy for yourself and your team. I think that always goes a long way. If you don't want your reporters to use it at all, I think that's fine. I think that should just be communicated. I think it's important to have like AI trainings or just a discussion to start with, like do we as a team feel comfortable with this? And then if yes, then let's approach it with curiosity plus skepticism plus, and I totally had that. I approached AI first with like, I don't want to generative AI with, no, I love my models and my machine learning and my code, and I don't want to use it to.
Yeah, even computer scientists.
Yeah, it started with like, no, I don't want to do it to. I used it. I was like, okay. And then I was like, wow. And then it was no. So, and then when you're working with the reporter, either the reporter is skeptical or the editor is skeptical or you're skeptical. So figuring out like where your kind of balance. I think it's important.
Yeah, the how do we handle this as a process is also extremely important. We're going to talk about that during the pedagogy session a little bit later. But, you know, in our classrooms, we always say like, for those professors who have agreed to allow the occasional use of ChatGPT in a class in particular context, we say, please disclose to us when you use it. And then there's kind of like inconsistent disclosure, and like sometimes they forget, or like, you know, especially if you use it every day for like a lot of different things. And so in my class, at least, I got a Google form. Every time you submit an assignment, you put in the URL, you answer a few questions. One of the questions is, did you use ChatGPT? If you answer yes, then how did you use it? So you might want to think about that as an editorial process in your newsroom as well. Like if you're managing writers and you want to know every time they use AI, you can't just say, let me know. Maybe if you set up a process where every time they submit something to you, they're confronted with the question, it'll at least remind them to, oh yeah, I did use it for this. Let me mention that to my editor, right? So I think that's all the time we have for moderated questions. We have some Q&A? All right, we have some time for Q&A, so let's pass the mic around.
Amazing sessions. I will start with the ending. So Tazbia was saying about that adoption of new technology. So I have my own experience because I work with the marginalized community. The moment I said, hey, do you guys want to have an AI tool, everybody wanted to get out of the room. So do you have this problem when you introduce non-tech savvy people who are journalists? Hey, we developed a tool, do you want to try it? So do you feel any resistance from them, and how you manage that? And you talked about the process. Then in this scenario, how we can introduce open AI tools or AI tools or generative AI tools to non-tech savvy people who are just don't want to mess up with any new tool? Thank you.
Yes, that's a great question. I face that all the time, also because I don't think I'm the best at, translating technical stuff, technical knowledge to non-technical. So I think that's an important skill I'm trying to build, which is like, I need to communicate every part of this process properly. And I think people are worried, rightly so. It's good that they start off on that foot, which is like, no, we get out of the room, we don't want to talk about it. Then it also gives you a chance to step back and reevaluate the whole thing, how you're talking to them, and also think about the larger goal of newsroom, the reporting and journalism in real. So I think you will always face that, especially if you're like the data computer science person in a team. And it's a good thing, because that's the reporter's job, to ask questions. They're going to ask you a lot of questions about every process, so you better know what you're doing. And I think it's just something ongoing. So I don't know what to say. I think, yes, I face it. Yes, the only way to go about it is clear communication, break it down for them, and also be clear about how you're using it and why, and make sure it all aligns with the end goal together as a team. So it's a collaborative process, yeah.
I just want to throw in one thing. I'm so fascinated by your question. We don't have time to discuss it, but I'll just say that I think it's really important to acknowledge that these tools are coming out of a capitalistic, entity and system and way of life that has been so damaging to marginalized people. And so I would say that more important than thinking about how do I teach, it's like, why do you have this apprehension? What has happened to you or your community that has led to you having this reaction? How do we address that? Even beyond like whether or not they, learn how to use the tools, because anyway, this like surveillance system and these tools really have been damaging to folks, and I think that's very important to acknowledge.
Yeah, and you might pick up something and decide you don't want to use it. So, other questions?
Hi guys. I am curious about how you all manage project deadlines and expectations, whether you're collaborating with someone or pursuing a project yourselves, especially because these tools are new and sometimes unpredictable, and you really can't be sure that they're accurate all the time. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the CJI folks on that, because we had a vision going in and things changed. So how did y'all manage expectations around timelines? And
it's sort of a calculus, right? It's like you want to invest time in something that's going to pay off in the end. And it ended up being like a really amazing learning experience, and I don't think any of us have any regrets. But it was sort of challenging because it is a little bit of a project in and of itself while you're also reporting. And so, we were up against a deadline to finish this database, and we were using our time to work on this AI tool that would help us speed that along. But then things started to move at different paces, so we just had to readjust. But I mean, I think with all things in this realm, transparency is important, and our editor was fully bought in to us taking a stab at this route and then just pivoting when we need to. So I mean, it was great to have sort of buy-in on that front, and jump ship when it's time.
yeah, and that's why I've kind of been advising them sort of, I think you can get the sense that I'm like, you don't need to finish this database. It's fine. We'll use it for other stuff. It was really valuable for getting us to this point. I've advised a couple of these projects now, and I think for me, it's been the identifying the moment when the tool stops serving you and instead you're serving the tool, right? You're trying to expend all this time and effort and you're like, but I got to see this process through to the end, and just resisting that that urge to say, I need to get to this destination, because none of us knew what the destination should have been to begin with, especially as we're defining these processes for the first time.
I would just add too, you might not necessarily know what the tool is for until you sort of get to a certain point. So at one point we thought that this was in an effort to sort of give us a complete database. And then later we realized it was a great way to sort of identify patterns, to surface, names. I mean, even that, for instance, you could easily look at what we did have and see that maybe there were some prosecutors in common across some of these cases. So I don't think that was necessarily our first impulse, but it changed as we sort of progressed.
Just one more thing, though. I think to some extent, if you just want to get the project started, just doing the data exploratory phase of it, taking a stab with an LLM might just give you a sense of direction, even if you don't decide to use it for every single aspect of the story, just to see whether the story has any momentum to it. I think an LLM is a great starting point, even if you don't decide to stick with it.
Yeah, I think we're finding more and more in our experiments that it's a great prototyping tool. It doesn't require a whole lot of code or technical expertise to start just trying things out. And a good chunk of the value that we thought was going to come from the full process, I would say at least a couple of projects, 60, 70% of the value just came from the let's just goof around with this in the browser phase of the project. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for your very stimulating presentations. I want to ask you about how this has been applied to sound and radio, because I represent and work with hundreds of community radio stations in the United States, approximately 200. And none of these kind of things, given the cost factors involved, have gotten to them. And what is interesting in listening to your presentations, I think about the whole initiative at Shorenstein, when they're complaining about the collapse of local news reporting because of the change in print journalism. And it seems to me I think a project would be interesting to see how this could actually help at the grassroots democracy through that kind of medium, through actual basic community radio stations around the country that are threatened, if we have a change in the White House, with extinction, because CPB funding is to be eliminated, NSC licenses are to be pulled, et cetera. So I'm just curious, the sound issue, and are there ideas to sort of, how do you take this and make it broad to the masses of people in our country, apart from just simply, different organizations that have the resources to fund these things? How does it get democratized, this technology?
Yeah. Does anyone have specific radio responses, or I also have some general thoughts as well?
I have sound response. There are a few things in that question, so I don't think I'm going to answer it fully, but I'll just say that there are tools that are being, like recently, for example, Notebook LM was published by Google. What it does is that I haven't tried it out yet, so I don't know how good it is, but what it does is that it takes any like PDF that you pass to it and turns it into a podcast. And what that makes me think of in the context of what you're saying is that it is possible to use some of these models to repurpose content to make it more accessible to people who may not be able to read an article for a variety of reasons, or may not have the reading level to sit with whatever content you're putting out, or maybe don't have the time or the patience to listen to a full episode of whatever. And so I think in terms of democratizing and making information accessible, it is possible, I think, to use some of these models to do that. But I don't have very specific use cases to offer you, unfortunately, so it's a bit vague, but that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, the other thing I'm hearing in this question is like, something that's true of all news, right? Like the kind of resource constraints and how do we kind of use this stuff when there are so few of us trying to do so much. One common adage in machine learning is automate the boring stuff. And so I would also just think through, like, within the organization, what are the things that are not the core thing where journalists add value, or rather just like organizational processes and like things that AI can help with. My other thought is also one of the benefits of an AI tool is it's really fast. And so like I actually use it to manage my own anxiety around my to-do lists. Like I'll just drop my whole to-do list in there and be like, can you like help me organize this in terms of like most to least, the biggest to smallest tasks in here or something. And it'll take a first crack at doing that and sort of surface the ones that I'm like, give me a small task to do that's like easy. But it does that in seconds, right? Whereas like before I would have had to spend 20 minutes reading through my to-do list and like identifying all the different things. So for radio in particular, I'm thinking about like, are there some things that it can do when you're live that, we've got 7 callers with 10 different questions, like which, maybe it'll help you sort through them or something like that. So these are some initial thoughts that I have around this.
Yeah, and I think with sound, there are some, with sound and audio and radio, there are some tools, AI tools that can do stuff even in real time while live, which is like identify the speaker diarization, translation. It could, and accessibility is, I think, possible with. We just started experimenting with this, but are we able to have a sign language script for our for a podcast that we have? So these kind of experiments, they are emerging. I think how we democratize it and provide it to the mass is, I think, as a industry, we need to think about open sourcing. Even if it's just an initial idea of how we got there, how we get to an experiment, I think open sourcing and then letting more local, hyper-local newsrooms access to that might help.
Yeah, some of this is about community building as well. I mean, I think like Ryan and Willow, for example, when this piece comes out, we're planning on publishing a methodology. We're like, we should contact reporters in other states and show them how we did it and what we did. And I imagine with specific contexts like radio, that could also be helpful. Where like, okay, one radio station did something really interesting. Maybe we can build a little community around who are the people at all the radio stations that are experimenting with this stuff, and like, what are you doing, and could I use what you're using? But yeah, some of it is not technical either. It's just a community building sort of thing. Okay, any other questions?
Hi, thank you so much. Great session. So recently, recently Alex Morgan, one of US soccer's greatest ever players, she retired. She played her last game. Now ESPN's AI report of that game did not mention Alex Morgan even once. Now obviously it didn't go through the editing process, but it got me thinking, and I'd like your opinion of the same about biases. Now AI also shows its own biases. Okay, about, it could be about gender, it could be about color, it could be about your lifestyle as well, it could be about money. In sport, it is very prevalent. Have you all seen it in your fields as well? And I don't see how there's a way we can avoid it, because even if as an editor, he or she also has their own biases. So AI will also have it. So is there a way that it can be completely neutral? I would think not, but happy to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I have a sort of techno-solutionism answer that I don't love, but I do want to sort of mention in a second. But I'm going to start with Andrew because I think he's thought deeply about this question.
He has? No, I have thought about it, but I don't have a solution per se. I mean, one of the problems. So okay, this isn't like a full answer per se, but like one of the problems. I think asking yourself why are the machines biased, right? And it's because of the data that's being passed in and where the data is coming from. And so one of the ways in which you could potentially address that is that for specific instances, if you can generate your own data and train a model, then you might be able to forestall some of those issues. There are also like things you can do, and a lot of tech companies are doing this, like building in these filters, benchmarks to be able to identify biases when the output comes in. So there are solutions that are being implemented right now. But the reason why I mention that is because at the Marshall Project, we've been talking a lot about like what it would mean for us to publish a model that is trained on fully on data that we have compiled, that we have vetted, that we have identified to be, as good as possible, so that when someone uses it, there's less likelihood of some of those biases emerging and really creating ground truth data sets. It's interesting because I've noticed that it's not the sexiest thing. Like it's not often the thing that gets the most research, but the whole reason that these models can do what they do is because of the data that we have produced that companies are monetizing. And now I've seen this tendency in tech to actually create synthetic data. So using models to basically avoid us as producers that they're extracting information from, create synthetic data using these same models, which will just further, I think, deepen that problem. And so I actually think going back to the unsexy part is really important, and that's what that question makes me think of.
Yeah, I'll also give an answer from the classroom. Some ways to mitigate this are about how you use the tool yourself. So for example, there was a great study out of Stanford a little while back talking about how for certain creative tasks, if you are a highly creative person, using ChatGPT will sort of bring you to the median. And if you're like running low on ideas, like it'll kind of also bring you to the median. But when we say the median, I mean like whatever the model assumes is like the statistically most likely answer, right? And so one of the things we do in class is think through like where is the creativity in this process, and like am I outsourcing that to the model or not? So for example, we might have an assignment that says come up with 5-story ideas about the subway system in New York City, right? And you could ask ChatGPT come up with 5 ideas about the subway system in New York City, and it'll give you 5 ideas. But a way to do that where you're not outsourcing the creativity is come up with as many ideas, like I'll tell the student, come up with as many ideas as you can about the subway system in New York City. They come up with a comprehensive list of ideas. Once they run out of ideas, then I'm like, okay, now put this in the LLM and go, are there other things that I might have missed? So thinking through like where the creativity is and trying to use the tool more for, I guess, automation than creativity is one thought. And then the other kind of more techno-solutionism answer that I don't totally love, but is a thing that you should know, is that you can prompt, like the model will have biases across the board, but you can kind of try to prompt your way into a corner of the model, like see the problem from different perspectives within the model, and I'll tell you what I mean in just a second. So we're all operating entirely in the world of the model. Things are biased. Things are pretty bad. But there's a study a while back that was like looking at the prompts where you say, I want you to be a tour guide. Tell me about what are the places I should go when I visit Quebec, right? And that gives you a certain set of answers. But if you tell it you are a Canadian tour guide who lives in Quebec, give me answers about where I should go as a tourist, it will give you a different set of answers that are more specific to Quebec. The other thing it realized was if you tell it that it lives in Quebec and then ask it questions about the Netherlands, it might give you less accurate answers about the Netherlands. And so you can kind of put the model by, it responds well to you are blank, and so you can kind of put it into different corners of the semantic space of the model, but the problem is you're still entirely in the semantic space of the model, so it doesn't really help.
Yeah, just an extension to what Dhrumil is saying. There was a project I did recently where I had the model identify its own biases or identify the biases of a narrative by putting in an assist saying, you are a gender studies professor who studies XYZ, identify all the cases of biases in said text. And it did a fairly good job of identifying certain things that would be pointed out by a professor of that discipline. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, but again, entirely in the very biased space of the model. So like not a solution, but like maybe a kind of sort of mitigation, maybe.
One thing I will add is that it is true, like biases that exist in the world always exist in models. And even though like technical companies are now trying to have these kind of safeguards, so if you ask it, and when we were just experimenting with generative AI in the class last year, we were doing this where you ask it to spit out 4 images of a student, and it will try to latch onto stereotypes and biases. And I think it's important that I think there's also, I don't know, I mean, it's not a solution, but I think there should be more reporting, and I know this is an interest area for you, Dhrumil.
Yeah.
There should be more research and reporting, also investigating these algorithms that we are using, and I think that journalism will always serve well.
Yeah, I saw Steve with that.
Yeah, I could actually, and I know I've like spoken a lot. I'm sorry, I'm afraid I'm not. But I just want to say one more thing to that comes to mind as I heard you all is, I think there's also a really tremendous opportunity here to maybe address 2 problems at once. There's the trust problem as well in the news industry. If you create, if you reach out to your audience and you ask them, can you help us, we want people to volunteer, or if you can pay them, that's great, that'd be better. But volunteer to help us vet the outputs of some of this work that we're using AI for, and you find people who are close to the issues that you're talking about, you can share that information. I'm sure if they had sent you that news report in advance, you would have been like, why isn't this person that you just mentioned in here? It's really important. So I think going back to people and getting out of the tech space can be a really good thing. And I've found, because I've worked on projects, people are usually very eager to work with newsrooms to do this kind of work. It makes them feel included, it makes them feel seen, represented, and it ultimately gets them kind of distributing the work for you. So I just think you can feed a lot of birds with one stone.
And I think the tech companies' solutions to these things are sometimes ridiculous. And I think we saw a little bit of that yesterday, where it was like, you ask it to generate a police officer, and they've just got this algorithm in the back that randomly inserts a race, and then so you end up with, give me a historical person from the whatever period in China, and it shows you an Indian person because they've just randomly inserted a race in there. So I would also say definitely not just don't rely on the tech companies, but it's actually a really great opportunity for reporting as soon as you notice one of those things to make that publicly knowledgeable. Public knowledge.
One thing I will say is that I think AI is kind of, to Andrew's point, I think it is when you kind of bring your readers or your subscribers into your editing process, they really engage with it makes your reporting better, it makes the trust in your platform better, it makes overall trust in journalism better, and that's how I think I've worked in a very local newsroom for a year, so that really bolsters local news that people that read that news care about. I think it's also so important that we treat journalism as an evolving industry. So if we are using AI and all of these questions are coming into place, it's also we need to think about, okay, just how are we operating as a newsroom also, just those strategies. I think it's very cool that we get to think about all this.
That's a great note to end on. I do think it's really cool that we get to think about all this. Thank you all very much for all of your wonderful questions. These are the resources that Andrew mentioned earlier. You can scan it, click on the document, and that Padlet is available if you want to see everyone's questions later on. Thanks.